These are 11 British royal palaces that served as homes, prisons, courtrooms, hospitals, and stages for scandals that altered the crown. Some still house royal ceremonies, while others survive only as one hall, a buried foundation, or a familiar name on a modern map. Taken together, they reveal something that polished state-rooms can hide. A palace was never simply a large and expensive home. It controlled access to the monarch, placed favourites close to power, kept rivals under watch, and turned private family troubles into matters of government. A locked apartment could become a prison without any bars, a bedroom could decide the succession, and a fire in a servant's room could erase centuries of royal display. The building shaped the story. That is the thread running through this account. We will begin at Westminster, where royal space slowly became the machinery of Parliament, then follow the crown through the Tower, Greenwich, Hampton Court, Whitehall, St James's, Kew, Kensington, Holyrood House, Buckingham Palace, and Windsor Castle. Along the way, familiar legends will be kept separate from documented events. The truth is strong enough, without turning every corridor into a ghost story. The first palace is Westminster, although most people now call it the Houses of Parliament. Its royal history reaches back more than 900 years, long before the clock tower, the Gothic riverfront, or the chambers seen on television. King Canute began a royal residence on Thorney Island around 1060, and Edward the Confessor developed a palace there while overseeing the construction of Westminster Abbey. Church, court, treasury, and royal household gathered within the same small district. Power was becoming fixed to a place. William Rufus added Westminster Hall between 1097 and 1099. Its scale announced authority, but the hall soon became something more unsettling for the crown. Because the same room built to magnify kings repeatedly became a place where royal power was challenged. Government offices settled around it, law courts used it, and assemblies met nearby. By the 13th century, Westminster had grown into the working centre of royal administration, as well as a residence. Richard II gave the hall its extraordinary hammer beam roof in the 1390s, and covered the building with royal emblems. The decoration made a clear claim: this was the king's space. Yet the first great political event held in the remodelled hall was Richard's own deposition on 30 September 1399. Architecture intended to make his rule look permanent instead framed its collapse. Westminster established a pattern repeated in later palaces, where royal display created the perfect public stage for royal humiliation. Charles I's trial in January 1649 pushed that contradiction further than ever before. A sitting king was accused and judged in a hall associated with royal justice, except authority had shifted from the monarch to a court created by his opponents. Days later, the sentence was carried out outside another palace at Whitehall. Westminster and Whitehall formed two halves of the same constitutional rupture. One supplied the courtroom, and the other supplied the final public stage. Fire changed Westminster just as politics had. A blaze in 1512 damaged much of the residential section, encouraging Henry VIII to abandon it for nearby Whitehall. Parliament then made the old palace its permanent home, although the site retained the formal title Palace of Westminster. Royal withdrawal did not empty the building of power. It allowed another institution to occupy the rooms the court had left behind. The greater disaster arrived on 16 October 1834. Workers were burning old wooden exchequer tally sticks in underfloor furnaces, and the heat ignited panelling in the House of Lords. Flames spread through the crowded medieval complex as thousands watched from the streets and river. Most of the palace vanished, along with almost all the records of the House of Commons, while Westminster Hall, the Jewel Tower, the Undercroft Chapel, and a few other fragments survived. Westminster shows how a palace can outlive its original owner by changing function. The second palace did something darker. At the Tower of London, royal security and imprisonment existed behind the same walls from the beginning. William the Conqueror began the Tower in the 1070s after taking a city whose loyalty he could not assume. Norman masons brought stone from Cayenne, English labourers supplied much of the work, and the Great Keep took roughly 20 years to complete. The building was defensive, but it was also psychological. Rising above the eastern edge of London, it told the conquered population that the new dynasty possessed both military force and permanent stone. Later monarchs expanded that original keep into a concentric fortress, with one ring of defences inside another. Henry III had the central tower whitewashed in 1240, giving the White Tower its enduring name, while he and Edward I added walls, towers, a moat, and royal apartments. Medieval kings did not regard the tower only as a dungeon. For about 500 years, it was also a palace where queens lived, rulers entertained, and coronation celebrations began. The fortress was not built as a prison, but incarceration became one of its defining uses. Ranulph Flambard, Bishop of Durham, was held there in 1100 and became the first recorded prisoner to escape. Over the following 8 centuries, the tower received foreign kings, nobles, clergy, courtiers, political conspirators, and ordinary offenders. Some occupied furnished rooms and kept servants. Others faced isolation and uncertainty in far harsher quarters. The disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother Richard in 1483 remains the tower's most famous unresolved mystery. The boys entered the fortress during the struggle that followed Edward IV's death and gradually disappeared from public view. Their uncle became Richard III, but no surviving document proves exactly when, where, or by whose order the princes died. Bones found during building work in 1674 were later examined and identified as belonging to 2 children of roughly the expected ages. Yet that did not establish their identities or settle responsibility. Certainty sells easily, but the evidence does not allow it. Richard III remains the best-known suspect, while other figures with access, opportunity, or later political motives have also been proposed. The honest version ends with an open case. 2 royal children vanished inside the country's most secure palace, and the institution responsible for guarding them preserved no answer that historians can verify. The Tudors turned the tower into England's central state prison. Anne Boleyn entered its royal apartments in triumph before her coronation in 1533, then returned as a prisoner 3 years later. Thomas More, Lady Jane Grey, Elizabeth before she became Queen, and Catherine Howard also passed through its gates during sudden reversals of fortune. Their individual cases differed, but each demonstrated the same rule: proximity to the crown offered no protection once royal confidence disappeared. Lady Jane Grey's story captures the palace at its most unforgiving. Placed on the throne during the succession crisis of 1553, the 17-year-old was displaced by Mary I after only days. Jane remained a political danger while rebellion continued in her name, even though older and more powerful men had built the scheme around her. She was executed at the Tower on 12 February 1554. A palace that had briefly recognised her as queen then held her as a prisoner of the queen who replaced her. Elizabeth arrived at the Tower that same year under suspicion of involvement in rebellion against her half-sister Mary. The journey carried an obvious warning, because Elizabeth knew what had happened there to her mother. She survived, left the fortress, endured house arrest elsewhere, and became queen in 1558. Her passage from prisoner to monarch is one of the clearest examples of how quickly Tudor status could reverse. Imprisonment at the Tower did not follow one standard pattern. Sir Walter Raleigh spent 13 years there during the reign of James I, yet high status brought 3 servants, family visits, study space, and access to a small garden where he grew plants for remedies. Those privileges did not make him free. The arrangement showed that a gilded cage was still a cage, with every comfort dependent on the authority holding the key. Torture occurred at the Tower, though less routinely than popular entertainment often suggests. Under the law and custom of the period, the monarch or Privy Council had to authorise it. James I issued such authority after Guy Fawkes was discovered in the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. The point was political extraction, rather than the everyday punishment of every prisoner. And the surviving warrant reminds us that violence at the Tower was bureaucratic as well as physical. From the Tower, the royal court often travelled upriver to Greenwich. Almost none of the Tudor palace remains above ground, which has allowed its part in several royal crises to fade from popular memory. Yet Greenwich Palace was a favourite home of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. A birthplace for three Tudor monarchs, and the setting where private disappointment repeatedly turned into national policy. The site had royal connections for centuries before the Tudors. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, developed a riverside house in the 15th century, and Margaret of Anjou later reshaped it into the Palace of Placentia. Henry VII rebuilt the residence between 1498 and 1504. Its position beside the Thames made travel to London easy, while nearby shipyards at Deptford and Woolwich connected the court to England's growing naval power. Henry VIII was born there in 1491. His daughter Mary followed in 1516, and Elizabeth was born at Greenwich on 7 September 1533. Preparations had assumed Anne Boleyn's child would be a boy. So official letters reportedly required a last-minute correction from prince to princess. That small alteration carried enormous meaning. A royal nursery was also a political chamber, because the sex and survival of one baby could affect religion, marriage, diplomacy, and the succession. Greenwich was built for pleasure as well as government. Henry created a major tournament ground there and enjoyed showing his athletic skill before the court. In January 1536, a jousting accident left him unconscious for a prolonged period after he fell, and his armoured horse came down on him. The incident did not instantly create the older Henry of popular memory, but it aggravated existing health problems and marked the danger inside royal performance. A sport designed to display control had exposed the king's vulnerability in front of the people whose fortunes depended on him. Anne Boleyn's position was collapsing at the same palace. In May 1536, orders for her arrest came while Henry was at the Greenwich tournament grounds, and she was taken from the riverside court to the Tower. The distance between celebration and accusation was physically short. Boats carried courtiers between palaces, but they also carried prisoners from royal sight to royal custody. Elizabeth later made Greenwich one of her favourite residences. In 1587, she signed the warrant authorising the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, there after months of hesitation. Elizabeth then reacted angrily when her ministers acted on it, insisting the process had moved faster than she intended. The episode exposed a recurring problem of palace government. A sovereign could delay, qualify, or privately resist a decision. But once a signed paper entered the administrative chain, control became harder to recover. Greenwich supplies a different kind of tragedy. It was not merely the loss of people, but the loss of a place so complete that later generations can stand on its footprint without seeing a palace at all. Its stories survived in documents, portraits, foundations, and the Queen's house nearby. The rooms where three Tudor monarchs were born have disappeared. Hampton Court survives in the opposite condition. It is vast, visible, and crowded with associations, yet its best-known legends can distract from the practical system that made the palace powerful. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey began transforming the property in the early 16th century, so he could receive Henry VIII and foreign rulers with suitable magnificence. The scale advertised Wolsey's access to the king, which made the building both an achievement and a risk. When Wolsey failed to secure the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, political favour drained away. Henry took control of Hampton Court in 1529, and Wolsey died in disgrace the following year. The transfer is often described as a gift, but the balance of power makes that word too gentle. A minister had built a palace to demonstrate closeness to his sovereign, then surrendered it when that closeness became dangerous. Henry expanded Hampton Court into a machine capable of moving, feeding, and ranking an enormous household. Up to 800 courtiers might accompany him, while about 200 cooks, grooms, pages, and other kitchen workers kept the supply system operating. Water came from springs 3 miles away. Food moved through specialized yards, stores, boiling houses, ovens, serving rooms, and accounting offices before it reached the appropriate table. Hampton Court's brightest dynastic moment arrived at 2 a.m. on 12 October 1537, when Jane Seymour gave birth to the future Edward VI after a difficult labour. Henry finally had the legitimate son he had sought through years of marriage, religious rupture, and political upheaval. Edward was christened in the Chapel Royal 3 days later, and the court celebrated a future that suddenly looked secure. The victory lasted less than 2 weeks. Jane died at Hampton Court on 24 October, and modern historians generally connect her death to childbed fever or another post-birth complication. Henry continued to honour her as the mother of his heir, including her in later family imagery, even after further marriages. The palace had delivered the succession and bereavement almost at once. Catherine Howard's fall began there in November 1541. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer left Henry a written report alleging misconduct by the young queen, and an investigation followed inside a court built around watching, access, and information. Catherine was questioned and placed under house arrest at Hampton Court before being moved to the Tower. Her downfall shows how quickly private rooms could become controlled territory once guards, counsellors, and closed doors replaced normal court life. The famous story that Catherine escaped her guards and ran through the gallery to beg Henry for mercy belongs to palace legend. Historic royal palaces presents it as a claim rather than a documented fact, and no secure contemporary account proves the dramatic dash happened. Her arrest at Hampton Court is real, as are the investigation and later execution. The screaming figure in the gallery is the part history cannot confirm. Other Tudor crises receive less attention. Elizabeth contracted smallpox at Hampton Court in October 1562 and recovered by the end of the month, but the illness reminded ministers that the unmarried queen had no settled successor. During Mary I's reign, the court gathered at Hampton Court in 1555, expecting the birth of an heir that never came. Both episodes turned a sovereign's health into a national emergency, because the future of the state seemed to rest inside a private royal body. The Stuart rebuilding created a second palace beside the Tudor one. William III and Mary II commissioned Christopher Wren after taking the throne in 1689, producing the sharp architectural contrast visitors still cross today. Yet their time there brought its own losses. Mary's death from smallpox in 1694 changed William's court, and a riding accident at Hampton Court in 1702 preceded the illness from which he died at Kensington. On 30 July 1700, 11-year-old William, Duke of Gloucester, died at Hampton Court. He was Queen Anne's only child to survive early childhood and the remaining Protestant Stuart heir. His death helped create the succession problem answered by the Act of Settlement in 1701, which directed the crown toward the Protestant Hanoverian line. Once again, an event inside a palace bedroom change the future dynasty. Royal occupation ended in 1737, and many rooms became grace and favour apartments for people with court connections. The palace developed into an unusual residential community, elegant but often cold, damp, and inconvenient. Queen Victoria opened it more fully to the public in 1838, and by 1881, more than 10 million visits had been recorded. Some residents resented the crowds entering grounds they had treated as private. Hampton Court's strongest story is not that Henry VIII's ghost walks its corridors. It is that the palace repeatedly converted domestic events into state consequences. Wolsey's fall, Edward's birth, Jane's death, Catherine's arrest, Mary's expected heir, Elizabeth's illness, and the loss of the last Protestant Stuart child. These were family matters only in the narrowest sense. Inside a monarchy, family was government. The court's next great centre stood closer to Westminster. Whitehall grew from York Place, another residence associated with Wolsey, and Henry VIII turned it into the principal royal palace after the 1530s. Over time, the complex spread across roughly 23 acres and contained more than 1,500 rooms. It was less a single-designed building than a royal neighbourhood of chambers, galleries, offices, lodgings, gardens, recreation spaces, and passages crossing busy streets. Only one complete building from the palace remains, the banqueting house designed by Inigo Jones and completed in 1622. Its classical order broke sharply with Tudor brickwork. The Great Hall hosted masques and receptions, while the ceiling later received 9 canvases by Peter Paul Rubens, commissioned by Charles I to celebrate the reign and supposed wisdom of his father James I. The paintings were installed in 1636. Their imagery lifted James toward heaven and presented Stuart monarchy as stable, peaceful, and divinely supported. Rubens received £3,000 and a gold chain, though he apparently never saw the completed ceiling in place. 13 years after installation, Charles I passed beneath that painted celebration of kingship before reaching the scaffold outside. Few buildings contain a sharper contradiction. The ceiling argued that monarchy belonged within a sacred order, while the crowd beyond the windows witnessed a state acting against its king on 30 January 1649. Charles had been tried at Westminster Hall, but Whitehall turned the judgment into public theatre. The palace, built to display unquestioned rule, became the setting for its rejection. On the afternoon of 4 January 1698, a Dutch maidservant left linen drying near a charcoal brazier in a bedchamber. The cloth caught fire, then the bed hangings, and the flames moved rapidly into the larger palace. The blaze burned for about 15 hours, appeared to ease, and then revived when wind carried fire toward another section. Whitehall's size, timber, and confusing connections now worked against it. William III ordered parts of the surrounding structure pulled down to protect the banqueting house. That brutal firebreak helped save the one building whose stone walls and open position offered a chance of survival. Most of the palace became uninhabitable, and the royal household did not rebuild it. A domestic lapse in one room ended the principal residence of the English monarchy. Whitehall disappeared so thoroughly that government later occupied its name. Modern departments line the street, and Downing Street stands near the old palace footprint. The crown moved elsewhere, but the machinery of the state remained. Like Westminster, Whitehall demonstrates that royal space could be inherited by institutions even after royal bedrooms vanished. St. James's Palace rose during the same Tudor expansion. Henry VIII built it between 1531 and 1536 on the site of the Hospital of St. James, creating a smaller retreat near Whitehall and a new royal park. Its red brick gatehouse still survives, but the palace became more important after Whitehall burned, housing monarchs and court offices while preserving a formal status that Buckingham Palace never completely replaced. Mary of Modena, wife of the Catholic James II, gave birth to a son named James Francis Edward. His arrival displaced James's Protestant daughter Mary in the expected line of succession and raised the prospect of a continuing Catholic dynasty. Opponents claimed the pregnancy had been false and that another baby had been carried into the palace inside a warming pan. The accusation was propaganda, not a credible account of the birth. Numerous witnesses had been present, yet political distrust proved stronger than direct testimony. Printed claims turned an ordinary household object into one of the age's most effective symbols, allowing opponents to call the infant an impostor and later the pretender. A palace bedroom could no longer keep dynastic privacy separate from public opinion. The warming pan story mattered because people were prepared to believe it. James had alienated large parts of the political nation through his religious policies and use of royal authority, so the birth looked less like family happiness than a threat to the constitutional future. Within months, William of Orange landed in England. James fled, and William and Mary accepted the crown under new parliamentary conditions. The rumour did not cause the Glorious Revolution by itself, but it helped make the royal family's own explanation seem untrustworthy. St. James's survived that change and gained importance after Whitehall's destruction in 1698. Monarchs lived there for part of each reign until William IV, while the court remained formally attached to the palace. A fire in 1809 destroyed much of the east and south ranges, including private apartments, and the lost rooms were never fully rebuilt. The palace kept its ceremonial identity even as its residential role declined. Today, ambassadors are still accredited to the Court of St. James's, and the palace hosts up to 100 charity receptions in a year. Accession councils meet there when a sovereign dies, and a successor must be formally proclaimed. Buckingham Palace may dominate modern imagery, but the older Tudor building retains the legal and ceremonial language of the court. Kew Palace tells a more intimate story. It is the smallest of the royal palaces in this account, and its modest red brick rooms seem far removed from Whitehall's 1,500 chambers. During the 18th century, that privacy attracted George III, Queen Charlotte, and their large family. Kew offered distance from the formal court, scientific interests in the surrounding gardens, and the appearance of domestic normality. Normality proved fragile. In 1788, George III experienced a severe period of mental and physical illness, and doctors transferred him to the White House, beside the building now called Kew Palace. The move was presented as a change of surroundings that might help him recover, but it also removed a visibly unwell monarch from the centre of government. Kew became both retreat and confinement. The treatment reflected late 18th century medicine rather than modern psychiatric care. Physicians used harsh physical procedures, restraints, and strict control, believing discipline could correct behaviour they did not understand. Records from the household show that the king's condition initially worsened after his arrival. Privacy protected the crown's image, but it also gave doctors extensive authority over a patient who remained the head of state. George recovered in 1789 and resumed his duties. Recurrences followed in 1801 and 1804. Then a deeper decline in 1810 led Parliament to establish the Regency in 1811. His eldest son exercised royal authority while the king lived in seclusion. The crisis forced ministers to answer a difficult constitutional problem. Government needed a functioning sovereign, even when the person wearing the crown could not perform the role. Kew shows that royal confinement did not always require an accusation of treason. Illness alone could place a monarch under constant supervision, separated from public work and controlled by physicians, relatives, and attendants. The rooms were comfortable, but the king did not control the terms of his stay. Palace privacy had become a medical and political barrier. Queen Charlotte's final years added another layer. By 1818, George was living in seclusion at Windsor, while Charlotte's own health left her largely confined to Kew. Two of their sons arranged a double wedding in the palace drawing room because their mother could not travel. Charlotte died in her bedroom there later that year. The weddings were driven partly by a succession crisis. George and Charlotte had 15 children, yet by 1817 their only legitimate grandchild, Princess Charlotte, had died following childbirth, and her baby did not survive. The king's unmarried sons hurried to form recognised marriages and produce an heir. One of those unions led to the birth of the future Queen Victoria at Kensington Palace in 1819. Kensington Palace received the child who emerged from that succession crisis. The building had entered royal use much earlier, when William III and Mary II acquired Nottingham House in 1689 and employed Christopher Wren to expand it. They wanted cleaner air and a residence outside the crowded centre of London. What began as a healthier retreat soon became a brilliant court and then a house of repeated loss. For 3 years from 1691, William and Mary filled the new rooms with balls, drawing rooms, gaming, music, and large suppers. One contemporary guest estimated that at least 1,000 people attended a particularly grand entertainment. The palace did not merely host society. It arranged society, allowing ambassadors, nobles, favourites, and petitioners to measure their distance from the sovereign by where they stood and which doors opened to them. Mary died from smallpox at Kensington in December 1694. William continued the building work but lost much of his interest in the grand social life they had created together. After a riding accident near Hampton Court in 1702, he became ill and died in the King's Gallery at Kensington. Two monarchs who had sought the palace for health found their final years tied to it. George II and Queen Caroline created Kensington's Georgian high point. Caroline welcomed politicians, writers, scientists, artists, and thinkers, while the court's social life revolved around access to her rooms. Yet the royal household split around the king's conflict with his eldest son, Frederick, Prince of Wales. In 1737, George banished Frederick and his family from court, turning physical exclusion from the palace into a declaration of political disgrace. Princess Victoria was born there on 24 May 1819. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and the ambitious household officer John Conroy imposed a strict programme later known as the Kensington system. Victoria grew up under constant supervision, saw few other children and could not even walk downstairs without someone holding her hand. The rules were presented as protection and preparation, but they also aimed to make the future queen dependent on the adults controlling her household. The system failed in its political purpose. Victoria came to resent Conroy and resisted attempts to grant him lasting authority. Early on 20 June 1837, officials arrived at Kensington to tell the 18-year-old that William IV had died and she was queen. She held her first Privy Council in the Red Saloon that day, then moved to Buckingham Palace within weeks. Leaving Kensington gave Victoria both a public headquarters and personal distance from the system that had governed her childhood. A palace had functioned as a nursery, school and controlled environment, but accession allowed its resident to walk out as sovereign. The same rooms that limited her movement became the setting where she first exercised independent power. Kensington later became a collection of royal homes rather than the monarch's principal residence. Princess Louise, Princess Margaret, Diana, Princess of Wales and other members of the family occupied parts of the complex across different generations. When Diana died in Paris in 1997, the palace gates became a focus for public mourning, and more than 1 million floral tributes were estimated to have been left outside. That response changed the meaning of the building. Kensington had once kept a future queen away from public life, but the modern palace became a surface on which the public expressed its own view of monarchy. Flowers, notes, and crowds occupied the boundary between royal privacy and public expectation. The gates did not merely keep people out, they became the place where the relationship between palace and street was negotiated. To understand royal palaces across Britain rather than England alone, the route must move north to Edinburgh. The Palace of Holyrood House stands at the end of the Royal Mile, opposite the modern Scottish Parliament and beside the ruins of Holyrood Abbey. Its history connects medieval religion, Scottish monarchy, dynastic violence, rebellion, and the present crown in one compact site. David I founded the abbey in 1128, and royal lodgings gradually developed nearby. James IV created a palace around the beginning of the 16th century, while James IV added the northwest tower that contains the oldest surviving royal apartments. Those chambers became inseparable from Mary, Queen of Scots, even though she lived at Holyrood House for only 6 years between 1561 and 1567. Mary returned to Scotland after the death of her first husband, Francis II of France, and entered a kingdom divided by religion and noble rivalry. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in the Palace Chapel in 1565. The marriage deteriorated quickly as Darnley demanded power and resented the influence of Mary's Italian secretary, David Rizzio. On 9 March 1566, Darnley joined conspirators who entered Mary's private rooms and killed Rizzio nearby. Mary was pregnant, and the attack was designed not only against a servant, but against the Queen's authority. The palace apartment, supposedly the most protected and personal space in Scotland, had been penetrated by men connected to her own husband. The event reveals the limits of royal architecture. A winding stair, thick walls, guards, and controlled chambers meant little when members of the household and nobility helped the attackers enter. Mary escaped the immediate political trap, but trust inside her court had broken. Darnley was killed the following year away from Holyrood House. Rebellion gathered, and Mary was forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, James VI. Later visitors became fascinated with Mary's rooms, and housekeepers developed tours around the tragedy. Claims about permanent bloodstains and perfectly preserved furnishings helped turn political violence into heritage spectacle. The chambers are genuinely historic, but objects and surfaces acquired stories over generations. Holyrood House demonstrates how a palace can preserve an event while also accumulating legends around it. The building continued to absorb conflict. During the 1745 Jacobite Rising, Charles Edward Stuart established court at Holyrood House while claiming the throne for his father. Government troops later damaged portraits in the Great Gallery after the Jacobite defeat at Falkirk in 1746. Of the original series of 111 imagined Scottish royal portraits, many still bear marks from that episode. Those paintings are not reliable likenesses of every ancient ruler they claim to show. They were created as a visual genealogy, connecting later Stuarts to a long Scottish past. Damage inflicted by soldiers added a second political message over the first. The gallery became both an argument for dynastic continuity and evidence of how violently that argument was contested. Holyrood House remains the monarch's official residence in Scotland. Ceremonies, audiences, and receptions continue there, while visitors enter Mary's rooms and the state apartments during public openings. Across the road, the Scottish Parliament represents a different source of political authority. Their proximity makes the old relationship between Crown and government visible in stone. The Scottish Palace also corrects an English habit of treating royal history as if everything important happened beside the Thames. The union of the crowns in 1603 did not erase separate institutions, memories, or identities. Holyrood House carried Scottish monarchy into the story of the United Kingdom, and its chambers record the moments when marriage, religion, and succession divided rather than unified the realm. Buckingham Palace offers the most familiar exterior and one of the shortest histories as a sovereign's main home. George III bought Buckingham House for Queen Charlotte in 1762, creating a private family residence near St James's. George IV later ordered a far grander transformation, and John Nash rebuilt the house into a palace with a ceremonial approach, wings, and a triumphal arch. Cost and delay troubled the project. Nash's plans expanded, spending rose, and the architect lost his position before the work was complete. William IV preferred Clarence House and showed little desire to occupy the unfinished palace. The building, intended to embody modern monarchy, waited for a young queen willing to make it work. Victoria took up residence in July 1837, becoming the first sovereign to live there, and left from Buckingham Palace for her coronation in June 1838. She had escaped the restrictions of Kensington, but her new home carried practical problems. Chimneys smoked, rooms were cold, ventilation was poor, and the arrangement did not easily support both a growing family and the work of the court. Marriage to Prince Albert exposed those shortcomings. New construction eventually produced the East Wing, closed the forecourt, and moved Nash's triumphal arch to the site now known as Marble Arch. The large ballroom, completed in 1855, created space for official entertainments and later state banquets. Buckingham Palace became not one finished masterpiece, but a sequence of solutions to problems created by earlier solutions. Its public image grew through ceremony. The east front and balcony offered a clear architectural focus for crowds, photographs, wartime appearances, weddings, jubilees, and coronation celebrations. That fade is now treated as timeless, yet it is a Victorian addition to a Georgian project built around an earlier private house. Monarchy often presents continuity through buildings assembled in stages. The Second World War tested that image. Buckingham Palace was bombed 9 times, and a raid on 13 September 1940 damaged the private chapel, while King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were present at the palace. The royal couple remained in London and visited bombed communities, using shared risk to narrow the distance between palace and public. Damage to the royal residence became part of the national wartime story. Security created a different crisis in 1982. Michael Fagan entered Buckingham Palace and reached Queen Elizabeth II's private rooms, exposing serious failures in alarms, communication, and police responsibility. Government records confirm that the Home Office investigated the intrusion. The event was startling because the palace represented the most protected domestic space in the country. Yet one person crossed its boundaries without an organized political plot or inside conspiracy. Popular retellings often invent a long political conversation between Fagan and the Queen. Reliable accounts do not support the elaborate exchange later shown in drama. The core facts need no embellishment. The intruder reached the monarch's bedroom. Help did not arrive immediately, and the breach forced a security review. As at Holyrood House centuries earlier, walls proved less dependable than the system operating inside them. Buckingham Palace today is an official residence and administrative headquarters, as well as the setting for state occasions and public openings. Its state rooms contain objects from the royal collection, while offices coordinate the working monarchy. The building seen by crowds is both symbol and workplace, with family apartments, ceremonial rooms, staff areas, service routes, and security functions overlapping behind one famous front. The palace's scandals are rarely hidden in secret tunnels. They arise from the mismatch between image and operation, an extravagant conversion that exceeded expectations, a new home that did not function smoothly, a guarded residence that could be entered, and a private family building required to perform as a national stage. Buckingham's fade promises control. Its history shows constant adjustment. Windsor Castle brings all these themes together. It is a fortress, palace, chapel, archive, tourist site, military community, burial place, and working royal residence. Begun by William the Conqueror in the 1070s, Windsor has been occupied and altered for nearly 1,000 years. The outer walls still follow the general position of the Norman castle, even though almost every generation reshaped what stood inside them. William chose a ridge above the Thames that guarded the western approach to London and lay about a day's march from the Tower. Henry II replaced major timber structures with stone in the 1170s. Edward III expanded the castle in the 14th century, founded the Order of the Garter, and made St. George's Hall central to a chivalric court. Defence slowly became ceremony, without ever disappearing completely. St. George's Chapel gave Windsor dynastic memory as well as worship. 10 monarchs are buried there, among them Edward IV, Henry VI, Henry VIII, Charles III, George III, George IV, and George VI. Queen Elizabeth II was laid to rest in the chapel in 2022, with close members of her family. Few palaces make the continuity of monarchy so physically present. Yet Windsor also imprisoned royalty. Parliamentarian forces took the castle in 1642, removed the dean and canons, and used the complex as a military headquarters and prison during the Civil War. Records show large numbers of royalist prisoners held in difficult conditions, with status still determining whether a captive could obtain slightly better treatment. Charles I was confined at Windsor in 1648 before his trial in London. After his execution the following January, his body returned to St. George's Chapel for an unmarked burial beside Henry VIII. A castle built to defend monarchy had become a prison for the king, then the resting place, chosen by the government that defeated him. Windsor preserved the dynasty and its overthrow within the same walls. Restoration in 1660 brought Charles II and an effort to make the castle magnificent again. New state apartments, painted ceilings, carving, and the Long Walk rebuilt royal display over the memory of military occupation. George IV transformed Windsor again in the 1820s, heightening its Gothic drama with architect Geoffrey Wyatville. Much of what appears ancient from a distance is a carefully strengthened 19th century image of the medieval past. The castle returned to defensive life during the Second World War. Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret spent much of the conflict there, while their parents remained active in London. They took part in air raid precautions, continued lessons, and lived under wartime restrictions. Windsor offered protection, but it also trained the future queen inside a building saturated with the duties and records of earlier reigns. On 20 November 1992, fire broke out in Queen Victoria's private chapel. Flames moved through roof spaces and damaged or destroyed major rooms, including St. George's Hall, the Grand Reception Room, the State Dining Room, and the Crimson Drawing Room. The castle's layered construction allowed fire to travel beyond the room where it began. Modern emergency services faced a building designed across centuries rather than for modern containment. The disaster came during a year Queen Elizabeth II later called an annus horribilis. Several royal marriages had broken down, public criticism was intense, and the question of who should pay for Windsor's repair became a national controversy. A palace could not be treated simply as private property when its history, collection, access, and symbolism belonged to a much wider public story. Restoration took 5 years and cost £37 million, finishing £3 million below budget on 20 November 1997. 70% of the required revenue came from opening Buckingham Palace's state rooms to paying visitors during August and September. That financial solution changed the relationship between public access and royal conservation. A disaster at one palace helped open another. Craft workers restored surviving interiors and designed new Gothic spaces where exact reconstruction was impossible or undesirable. St. George's Hall received a new hammer beam roof, joining modern engineering to a medieval visual language. The result did not pretend that 1992 had never happened. It allowed fire to become another layer in a building already shaped by conquest, civil war, restoration, and reinvention. Windsor remains the largest occupied castle in the world and a working palace. St. George's Hall extends more than 55 metres and can seat up to 160 guests at a state banquet. The Round Tower houses the Royal Archives. Soldiers maintain a permanent guard. Chapel services continue. Residents live within the walls. And visitors move through state apartments when they are open. That mixture is Windsor's greatest strength and its deepest contradiction. The castle is presented as permanence, but almost nothing about it has remained untouched. Monarchs raised towers, moved apartments, rebuilt halls, altered skylines, restored chapels, and repaired fire damage. Continuity came from repeated change. Across these 11 palaces, the most important secrets were rarely supernatural. Westminster turned royal space into parliamentary power. The Tower joined splendour to custody. Greenwich disappeared beneath later development, while Hampton Court converted births, illness and marriage into questions of state. Whitehall burned, St. James's survived through ceremony, Kew hid a king's incapacity. And Kensington raised a future queen, under rules meant to control her. Holyrood House carried the divisions of Scottish monarchy into the United Kingdom. Buckingham Palace learned to perform for a mass public while struggling with the practical risks behind its fade. Windsor endured because every crisis produced another act of rebuilding. Each palace promised stability, yet each was shaped by fear of rebellion, disputed succession, family conflict, illness, accident, fire, or public judgment. The buildings mattered because they organized human behavior. Long approaches made visitors feel small. Guarded doors filtered access. Galleries turned private movement into public display. And bedrooms became political chambers whenever an heir, illness, or rumour threatened the succession. Even a palace resident could be watched, isolated, or removed. Luxury did not cancel confinement. Their tragedies also changed institutions. The death of Anne's son at Hampton Court redirected the succession. George III's illness at Kew helped formalise a regency. Fire pushed Henry VIII from Westminster to Whitehall, then destroyed Whitehall and strengthened St. James's. The Windsor blaze opened Buckingham Palace to visitors as part of the funding solution. A palace crisis rarely ended at the palace gates. Today these sites occupy different positions. Some belong to the working monarchy, some to Parliament, some to heritage charities and museums, while Greenwich's main palace survives below ground. Their ownership, access and purpose have changed, but the old tension remains visible. They are public symbols built around spaces that were once intensely private. That is the history behind the Crown's polished rooms. Britain's royal palaces were homes, but they were also systems for displaying authority and managing danger. Their stones did not protect every dynasty, preserve every building, or keep every secret. What survived was the evidence of how power behaved when the doors were closed.